The courtroom hummed like a live wire, charged with the restless energy of anticipation. Every seat was filled, lawyers, reporters, victims and spectators, all packed shoulder to shoulder, their gazes locked onto the empty judge's bench. Journalists whispered into microphones, their voices barely above a murmur. Some scrawled notes furiously, while others sat poised with cameras, ready to capture what promised to be one of the most explosive trials in recent history. Today wasn't just another day in court. This was the day Nathan Rockwell would finally face justice. For weeks, his name had dominated headlines, not for his billion-dollar business empire or luxury lifestyle, but for the countless lives he had destroyed. He had built his fortune on deception, luring investors into schemes that were doomed from the start. His victims, not corporations, not hedge funds, ordinary people, teachers, firefighters, small business owners, all swindled out of their life savings. Some had lost their homes, their children's college funds, their retirements, and while they suffered, Rockwell thrived. The man who once rubbed shoulders with celebrities and politicians had become a national disgrace. But you wouldn't know it from looking at him. At the defendant's table, Nathan Rockwell sat like he was holding court, relaxed, unbothered, untouchable. He was a tall, commanding figure, his broad shoulders filling out his custom-tailored navy suit, a suit that probably cost more than some of his victims' entire net worth. His silver-streaked hair was slicked back to perfection, and on his wrist gleamed a watch worth more than a brand-new car. This wasn't a man facing justice. This was a man who thought he was above it. People whispered as they watched him. His reputation for arrogance and cruelty had been cemented long before this trial. He didn't just steal money, he mocked those he stole from. When reporters asked him about the families who lost everything, he had laughed. "People need to be smarter with their money," he had said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I didn't force them to invest with me." To the public, he was a monster. To himself, he was untouchable. Then the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The tension snapped tight. A voice rang out, clear and commanding, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Vanessa Carter." In unison, the courtroom stood, the lawyers, the jury, the press, even the spectators. The sound of dozens of chairs scraping against the polished floor echoed through the chamber. But Nathan Rockwell? He did not move. He stayed seated, his posture unbothered, almost lazy. One hand rested on the table, the other casually flipping through a stack of legal documents as if the very presence of the judge was an afterthought. The silence was deafening. People exchanged uneasy glances, whispers rippled through the crowd. Is he seriously not standing? He's not even looking at her? At the bench, Judge Vanessa Carter took her seat. She was a woman of unshakable authority, and she carried it effortlessly. The black robe draped over her tall, poised frame, her presence alone enough to command respect. Her deep brown eyes scanned the courtroom, her expression unreadable. But she had seen everything. She had seen his blatant defiance, his refusal to acknowledge her authority, his silent declaration that he, Nathan Rockwell, didn't need to play by the rules. And yet her face remained calm, controlled. Her reputation preceded her. For over 2 decades, Judge Vanessa Carter had built a name as one of the most fearless, no-nonsense judges in the country. She was known for her sharp mind, her unwavering sense of justice, and, perhaps most importantly, her ability to see straight through men like Nathan Rockwell. She had dealt with corrupt CEOs, power-hungry politicians, and arrogant criminals who thought their money shielded them from the law. And now she was dealing with him. "You may be seated," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. A quiet warning, The courtroom settled, but the air remained thick with tension. Nathan finally looked up, locking eyes with her for the first time. And then he smirked. To him, this was nothing more than a performance, a game where he held the upper hand. He had spent his entire life buying his way out of consequences. He had no idea what was coming next. Arrogant billionaire refuses to stand for black judge. What she does next leaves everyone stunned. Part 2. The Weight of Arrogance. For a moment, the silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Judge Vanessa Carter held Nathan Rockwell's gaze, her expression unreadable. She didn't flinch. She didn't scowl. She simply watched. Rockwell, on the other hand, grinned. It wasn't the nervous kind of grin, the one people flashed when caught in the wrong. No, this was a different kind. A calculated smirk, the expression of a man who had spent his entire life walking into rooms and owning them. To him, this was all beneath him. The murmurs from the crowd hadn't died down. Spectators stole glances at each other, unsure whether they had actually just witnessed the blatant disrespect they thought they had. But Judge Carter didn't react. She calmly adjusted her robe, placed her hands on the bench, and scanned the room. "This courtroom is now in session," she announced, her voice steady and composed. The bailiff stepped forward, reading the case details aloud. Case number 2745, the State versus Nathan Rockwell. Defendant is charged with multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. As the bailiff spoke, Rockwell barely paid attention. Instead, he glanced at his watch, a Rolex, limited edition. One of the only 10 in the world. It cost more than an entire year's salary for some of the officers in the courtroom. Judge Carter didn't miss the movement. She noticed everything, but she still said nothing. Instead, she turned to the prosecution. "Prosecution, you may proceed with your opening statement." The lead prosecutor, Daniel Hayes, stood. A sharp, seasoned attorney, Hayes had built his career taking down white-collar criminals like Rockwell. He adjusted his tie, took a slow breath, and then turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we are here today because the man sitting at that table," he gestured to Rockwell, who leaned back in his chair as if bored, "is a fraud, a liar, and a thief." Rockwell's smirk twitched, but he didn't react. "For years," Hayes continued, "Nathan Rockwell paraded himself as a financial genius. He promised hard-working families a better future. He looked them in the eye, shook their hands, and told them they could trust him." He turned to face the jury directly. But that was a lie. The tension in the room thickened. Jury members shifted in their seats. Some spectators in the audience nodded grimly. Hayes walked toward the evidence table, placing his hand on a thick folder of documents. "We have bank records, falsified contracts, and sworn testimonies from over 50 victims. We will show you how Rockwell drained people's life savings, stole millions, and walked away without a shred of remorse." Still, Rockwell didn't flinch. He just tilted his head, studying his fingernails, as if the prosecutor's words were nothing more than background noise. Hayes turned back toward the jury. And today, for the first time in his life, he will learn that wealth does not make you untouchable. The courtroom was silent. Judge Carter gave a small nod. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," she said. Then she turned toward Nathan Rockwell's defense attorney, a man named Philip Lawson. "Mr. Lawson, you may proceed." Lawson, a sleek, sharp-eyed man in an expensive Italian suit, stood. Unlike Hayes, he did not pace. He did not raise his voice. Instead, he simply buttoned his jacket and smiled. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what we have here is nothing more than a misunderstanding." A few quiet scoffs came from the audience, but Lawson ignored them. "My client, Mr. Rockwell, is a businessman, a successful one, And in business, there are risks. Some investments work out, others don't. That's just how the market works. Rockwell's smirk widened. But to punish a man for failed investments? Lawson shook his head dramatically. That is not justice. That is a witch hunt. Hayes stiffened. Judge Carter remained still. Rockwell. He crossed his arms, nodding in approval. And let's be clear, Lawson continued, this case is built on assumptions, not facts. Yes, there are victims, but that does not mean Mr. Rockwell committed a crime. It simply means they took a financial risk, and it didn't pay off. At the back of the courtroom, a woman covered her mouth with her hand. Her face flushed with emotion. Her name was Lisa Parker, a single mother of 2. She had invested everything she had with Rockwell. Now she was living out of her car, struggling to feed her kids. Her eyes burned with anger. But at the defense table, Rockwell only looked more confident. To him, this was playing out exactly as he expected. He had the best lawyers, the most expensive legal team money could buy. He knew how this worked. He had bought his way out before. He would do it again. Or so he thought. Because just as his smirk grew a little wider, Judge Carter finally spoke. Her voice was calm but firm. Mr. Rockwell, she said, her eyes never leaving his, let me remind you of something. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. You are no longer in a boardroom, she continued. You are no longer surrounded by people who answer to you. This is my courtroom, and in my courtroom you will conduct yourself with respect. Rockwell's smirk faded, just slightly. For the first time since the trial began, his confidence wavered. Judge Carter leaned forward slightly. You may believe that wealth makes you untouchable, she said, her voice never rising. But let me be perfectly clear, Mr. Rockwell. It does not make you above the law. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs. Reporters scrambled to write down her words. And for the first time, Rockwell's smirk completely disappeared. Judge Vanessa Carter wasn't intimidated by him. And something in her eyes told him this trial would not go the way he thought it would. Not this time. The weight of Judge Carter's words still lingered in the air. Nathan Rockwell, for the first time since stepping into the courtroom, looked different. His smirk had vanished, replaced by a hardened expression, his jaw clenching ever so slightly. For years he had controlled every room he walked into. For years he had been the most powerful person at the table. But here? He was just another defendant, and Judge Carter had made that clear. The murmurs in the crowd had barely settled before she turned her attention back to the attorneys. Mr. Lawson, she said, addressing Rockwell's lawyer, is that your full statement? Lawson adjusted his tie, smoothing over the moment. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Carter nodded. Then let's proceed. The prosecution wasted no time. Daniel Hayes, the lead prosecutor, approached the witness stand. The state calls Lisa Parker. A hush fell over the room as a woman in her mid-40s stood up from the front row. Lisa Parker moved slowly, hesitantly, her hands clutching the railing as she stepped onto the stand. Her clothes were simple but well kept, her expression tense. She was visibly nervous, but there was something stronger behind her eyes. Determination. She took the oath, her voice barely above a whisper, as she swore to tell the truth. Mrs. Parker, Hayes began, stepping closer, can you tell the jury how you first met Nathan Rockwell? Lisa swallowed hard, gripping the edges of the wooden stand. I didn't meet him in person, she said, only through his company. And what did his company promise you? Her lips trembled slightly, but she steadied herself. They promised everything, she said. A way out. A better future for my kids. A way to finally get ahead to stop living paycheck to paycheck. Rockwell shifted in his seat. They said it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, that if I invested my savings it would double, triple even, and I believed them. Hayes nodded. And did Mr. Rockwell ever personally communicate with you? Lisa's eyes flickered toward Nathan. No, she admitted. But his name was everywhere. His face was on every commercial, every website. He was the one saying, "Trust me." Her voice shook, but she kept going. So I trusted him. I put everything I had into his investment program, my entire savings, my kids' college fund, even took out a small loan because I was told I'd make it back within the year. The room was dead silent. And what happened? Hayes asked. Lisa's eyes darkened. It disappeared, she whispered. All of it. The website shut down, the customer service line stopped working, emails bounced back. One day I had a future, the next I had nothing. From the defense table, Rockwell exhaled loudly as if bored. Judge Carter's gaze snapped toward him. He didn't look at her. Hayes, ignoring Rockwell, turned back to Lisa. And what was the company's response when you reached out? Lisa let out a bitter laugh. They told me it wasn't their fault, she said. That I misunderstood the risks, that I should have read the fine print. Her eyes burned with emotion. But I know what happened, she continued, her voice stronger now. I know the truth. He stole from us, and he laughed while doing it. The gallery shifted, anger visible in the faces of the spectators. The prosecutor turned to the jury. Mrs. Parker, he said, can you tell us what your life has been like since losing your savings? Lisa's face fell. For a moment she hesitated. Then her shoulders straightened. I lost my home, she said, her voice firm but raw. I had to move my kids into my sister's basement. I can barely afford groceries. My oldest son had to drop out of college because I couldn't pay tuition anymore. A few jurors shifted uncomfortably. Nathan Rockwell? He just checked his watch. Lisa noticed. Her lips parted slightly in shock, as if she couldn't believe the level of disrespect. Her hands clenched. And then she turned to face him directly. You did this to us, she said, her voice sharp, unwavering. You stole from me, from my children, from all of us, and you don't even care, do you? Rockwell rolled his eyes, and that was it. Judge Carter had seen enough. A sharp bang rang through the room as she slammed her gavel down hard. Mr. Rockwell, she said, her voice dangerously calm. He finally looked at her. I have tolerated your arrogance long enough, she said. But let me make one thing clear. You will not disrespect this court, nor will you disrespect this witness. Rockwell leaned back, a smirk playing at his lips. And if I do? He asked, his voice mocking. Judge Carter tilted her head slightly. Then I will hold you in contempt, she said, and you will be spending tonight in a holding cell. The entire courtroom froze. Rockwell's smirk vanished. You can't do that, he said, his voice quieter now. Judge Carter met his gaze, unflinching, unmoved. Oh, Mr. Rockwell, she said smoothly. I can. And I will. The crowd erupted. Gasps, murmurs, reporters frantically scribbling notes. And Nathan Rockwell, for the first time, realized something. He wasn't in control anymore. The courtroom was alive with murmurs, voices rippling through the space like waves crashing on the shore. Judge Carter's warning hung in the air, thick with tension. Nathan Rockwell, the man who had spent his entire life untouchable, was suddenly faced with a reality he had never known. Consequences. For the first time in his highly curated, privileged existence, someone had the power to put him in his place, and she wasn't afraid to use it. He sat there, still leaning back in his chair, but something had changed. The usual arrogance, the untouchable smirk, It faltered, just for a second. He was calculating, trying to decide if he should push back. He had gotten away with worse before, walked into rooms with men twice as powerful as Judge Carter and left them shaken, desperate to win his favor. But this was different. Judge Vanessa Carter was not someone who could be bought. Her gavel was still in her hand, her expression cool, unwavering. "I trust we won't have to revisit this conversation, Mr. Rockwell," she said, her voice smooth but sharp. Rockwell's fingers tensed against the table. A full-blown confrontation was not in his favor, not yet. He knew the cameras were watching, the press ready to spin this into a headline that could hurt him more than he wanted to admit. So, with visible reluctance, he exhaled through his nose and nodded. "Fine," he muttered. Judge Carter's eyes didn't leave him. "Good, let's continue." She gestured for Daniel Hayes to proceed. The prosecutor wasted no time. He turned back to Lisa Parker, who was still seated on the witness stand, her hands gripping the wooden edges. "Mrs. Parker," he said, his voice softer now, "I know this is difficult, but I need you to answer one more question." Lisa nodded, swallowing hard. "After you realized your savings were gone," Hayes continued, "after Rockwell's company shut down their offices and disconnected their phone lines, did anyone ever reach out to you? Did Mr. Rockwell or his team ever offer an explanation?" Lisa let out a bitter laugh. "No," she said. "No one ever called. No one apologized. No one even tried to help us." Hayes turned his gaze toward the jury. "Not even the man sitting at that table?" Lisa's expression hardened. "Especially not him." A ripple of murmurs spread across the gallery. Even the jury members were shifting, some glancing toward Rockwell with visible unease. This was exactly what Rockwell's legal team had feared. The longer Lisa Parker spoke, the harder it became to spin the case in his favor. And Nathan Rockwell knew it. He leaned toward his attorney, muttering under his breath. Lawson nodded, then stood. "Your Honor," he said, buttoning his suit jacket. "With all due respect, I believe the prosecution is steering into emotional manipulation rather than factual evidence. This is a courtroom, not a therapy session." A few gasps from the audience. Lisa Parker's eyes widened. Hayes clenched his jaw, stepping forward. "Objection. The testimony of victims is critical evidence in a fraud case and—" Judge Carter raised her hand, silencing them both. Then she turned toward Lawson. The way she looked at him, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Mr. Lawson," she said, her voice dangerously quiet, "I suggest you think very carefully before disrespecting a witness in my courtroom again." Lawson's throat bobbed. He blinked, lips parting slightly, as if trying to decide whether to respond. The weight of her words was crushing. He exhaled, then sat back down. Judge Carter turned back to Lisa. "You may continue, Mrs. Parker." Lisa cleared her throat, glancing once more at Rockwell, who was now avoiding her gaze. "I just want him to know," she said, her voice raw, "that he didn't just take money. He took people's futures, people's hope, their trust." She looked at the jury. "And I want all of you to know that he didn't do this because he needed money." Her lips trembled, but she forced out the words. "He did it because he could." Silence. One of the jurors, a man in his late 50s with grey hair and kind eyes, rubbed his chin, his expression unreadable. Another juror, a young woman in her 30s, glanced toward Rockwell, then quickly away. The damage had been done. The jury was starting to see him for who he really was. Hayes nodded, satisfied. No further questions. Judge Carter turned to the defense. "Mr. Lawson, your witness?" Lawson stood slowly. "Mrs. Parker," he began, his voice silky smooth, measured. "You've been through a lot.
and I don't doubt that you've suffered. Lisa's jaw tightened. But, he continued, pacing slightly, you made a choice, didn't you? You chose to invest your money. You signed contracts. You understood the risks of investing, correct? Lisa's brows furrowed. I understood what they told me, she said. And what they told you, Lawson pressed, was that investing comes with no guarantees, that the market is unpredictable. Lisa exhaled sharply, her frustration growing. I was told it was safe, she shot back, that it was backed by real assets, that I couldn't lose. Lawson nodded slowly as if considering her words. And yet, he said, you never met my client personally, correct? Lisa hesitated. No. So, technically speaking, Lawson continued, Nathan Rockwell never personally promised you anything, did he? Lisa's hands clenched. He was the face of the company, she said, through gritted teeth. He made the commercials. His signature was on the documents. Lawson shrugged. Yet, you made the choice to invest, knowing there was always a risk. Wouldn't you say that's fair? A tense silence. Lisa didn't answer right away, because she could see what he was doing, twisting it, trying to shift the blame onto her. She opened her mouth to fight back, to say something, anything. But before she could, a voice cut through the air, a voice that carried power. Mr. Lawson, Judge Carter said coolly, are you suggesting that fraud is acceptable if the victim willingly participates? The courtroom froze. Lawson stiffened. Rockwell's fingers twitched. Judge Carter leaned forward slightly, her expression sharp. Because if that's your argument, she said, I have some very bad news for your client. Gasps, whispers. The entire courtroom was now locked in, every person hanging on her every word. Rockwell's jaw tightened. He knew now, without a doubt, that this was not going his way. The air in the courtroom felt different now, thicker, heavier. Judge Carter's words had landed like a hammer, shattering whatever confidence remained in Nathan Rockwell's smirk. For the first time, he wasn't sure he could win. His entire legal strategy was built on one simple tactic: confuse the jury, shift the blame, make the victims look like fools for trusting him. But Judge Carter? She wasn't letting it happen. At the defense table, Lawson adjusted his tie, trying to shake the weight of her words. His eyes flickered toward Rockwell, who gave him a small, barely perceptible nod. He needed to recover, fast. Your Honor, Lawson said, his voice measured, careful now. I'm simply pointing out that investing always carries risks. Mr. Rockwell never forced anyone's hand. Judge Carter raised an eyebrow. Continue, she said, but there was something in her tone, a warning. Lawson turned back to Lisa Parker, still sitting on the witness stand. Mrs. Parker, he began, you said that you lost your savings due to my client's company, correct? Lisa exhaled sharply. I didn't lose it. He stole it. Stole it? Lawson repeated, feigning surprise. Or was it a case of bad investments? Lisa clenched her fists. I was promised security. I was lied to. Lawson nodded slowly, then turned toward the jury. Jury members, he said smoothly, we must ask ourselves, is this fraud or is it just a business deal gone wrong? A few jurors shifted in their seats, and that's when Judge Carter spoke again. Mr. Lawson, she said, her voice calm, dangerously calm. Before you continue, I'd like to remind you that the definition of fraud is deception for personal gain. She leaned forward slightly, her sharp gaze locking onto him. And as we've already established, Mr. Rockwell's company promised guaranteed returns while fabricating financial reports. If you are attempting to argue that fraud isn't fraud because the victims believed the lies they were told, I suggest you rethink that strategy. Silence. Lawson froze.
Rockwell's fingers tightened into a fist because Judge Carter wasn't just rejecting their defense, she was exposing it. Lawson cleared his throat, forcing a tight smile. "Of course, Your Honor. I merely meant to—" "Then rephrase your question," Judge Carter cut in. "Or move on." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Even the jury, some of whom had seemed unsure minutes ago, were now glancing at Rockwell differently. Less like an unfortunate businessman, more like a guilty man grasping for straws. Lawson's jaw flexed. He knew the damage had been done. And Rockwell? For the first time, he looked uneasy. Hayes, the lead prosecutor, seized the moment. "No further questions from the defense?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Lawson hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then, slowly, he sat down. "No further questions," he muttered. Judge Carter nodded. "The witness may step down," she said. Lisa Parker let out a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing as she stood. She turned toward the jury one last time, her eyes locking onto them. "He took everything from me," she said, her voice steady now. "And he never even cared." Then, without another word, she walked back to her seat. The silence was deafening. Rockwell stared ahead, his jaw tight. Judge Carter turned to Hayes. "Prosecution, your next witness?" Hayes stood. He had been waiting for this moment. "Your Honor," he said, "the prosecution would like to call James Whitmore." A rustle of movement. Then from the back of the courtroom a man in his early 50s stood. The moment he stepped forward, Rockwell's face changed. His hands gripped the table. Because James Whitmore wasn't just any witness. He was Rockwell's former CFO, the man who had worked beside him for years. And now? He was about to testify against him. The courtroom stilled as James Whitmore stepped onto the witness stand. Nathan Rockwell's former chief financial officer, his right-hand man for over a decade, the person who knew where every dollar had gone. And now he was turning against him. Rockwell's hands tightened into fists as Whitmore took the oath, his shoulders stiff, his face unreadable. But there was something in his eyes, something Rockwell hadn't seen before. Regret. Judge Carter nodded. "You may proceed, Mr. Hayes." The prosecutor took a step forward. "Mr. Whitmore," Hayes began, "how long did you work for Nathan Rockwell?" Whitmore exhaled. 15 years. "And what was your role?" "I was the chief financial officer of Rockwell Enterprises." "Which means," Hayes pressed, "you had full knowledge of the company's financial operations, correct?" Whitmore hesitated, just slightly. Then he nodded. "Yes." Hayes glanced toward the jury, then back at Whitmore. "Mr. Whitmore," he said slowly, "can you tell the court what really happened inside Rockwell Enterprises?" A heavy silence. For a moment, Whitmore didn't speak. Then he leaned forward slightly, gripped the edges of the stand, and said the words that shattered Nathan Rockwell's entire defense. It was all a scam. Gasps erupted from the courtroom. Rockwell shot up from his chair. "James!" he hissed under his breath, his voice low but sharp. "What the hell are you doing?" Judge Carter's gavel slammed down. "Mr. Rockwell, sit down." Rockwell's jaw flexed, but he slowly sank back into his seat. Whitmore didn't even look at him. Hayes stepped closer. "When you say scam, what exactly do you mean?" Whitmore exhaled sharply. "I mean, there was never any real investment. We fabricated returns. We moved money around, made it look like people were earning when, in reality, their money was already gone." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. "And was Nathan Rockwell aware of this?" Hayes asked. Whitmore turned his head, locking eyes with Rockwell for the first time. He was the one who planned it. Rockwell's face turned ashen. "No," he said under his breath, shaking his head slightly. "This isn't happening," he muttered. Judge Carter tilted her head slightly, watching him carefully. But Whitmore wasn't done. We used shell companies to launder money. We falsified tax records. We took people's life savings and used them to finance Nathan's lifestyle, the jets, the mansions, the cars. Whitmore's voice didn't shake. Because for the first time in 15 years, he wasn't covering for Nathan Rockwell. He was telling the truth. And when you say we, Hayes pressed, who do you mean? Whitmore's jaw tightened. The executive team, he admitted. But Nathan gave every order. Rockwell finally snapped. This is ridiculous, he blurted out, loud enough for the entire room to hear. James, you're lying! Whitmore's eyes were steady. You know I'm not. Judge Carter slammed her gavel down again. Mr. Rockwell, she said sharply, if you interrupt this court again, I will have you removed. Rockwell's lips pressed into a thin line. His fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. For the first time, he looked cornered, and everyone in that room knew it. Judge Carter turned back to Whitmore. Continue, she said. Whitmore nodded, then looked back at Hayes. Nathan never thought he'd get caught, he said. He thought he was untouchable. That his money, his power, that it would protect him. Rockwell looked away, because deep down he knew it was true. But the truth is, Whitmore finished, he didn't care about anyone but himself. The words hung in the air. And the jury? They looked at Nathan Rockwell like they had already made up their minds. Hayes turned toward the judge. The prosecution rests, Your Honor. Judge Carter nodded. Very well. Then she turned toward the defense table. Mr. Lawson, she said, does the defense have any witnesses? Lawson hesitated, because this was the moment of truth. With Whitmore's testimony, everything had crumbled. There was nothing left to spin, nothing left to argue. So, with a defeated sigh, he slowly shook his head. No, Your Honor. The entire courtroom shifted, because that was it. This was over. Judge Carter exhaled quietly, then turned toward the jury. You have heard the evidence, she said, her voice steady. You will now deliberate. With that, the courtroom was dismissed. Rockwell didn't move, not right away, because for the first time in his life, he was completely powerless. The guards moved toward him, ready to escort him back to holding, and as they grabbed his arms, he turned toward Judge Carter, his eyes burning. You think this is over? He hissed. I will. Judge Carter didn't even blink. Take him away. The guards pulled him back, his voice fading as he was dragged from the courtroom. And the people, the victims? They stood. And for the first time they applauded, because finally, after all the lies, all the deception, all the arrogance, Nathan Rockwell was facing justice. And nothing could save him now. This case is just one of many examples of how wealth and power can be used to manipulate the system, but it's also proof that justice can prevail. What do you think? Do you believe the punishment was enough? Should Rockwell have faced a harsher sentence, or do you think the system still favors the rich? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story powerful and eye-opening, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Because in a world where power often wins, stories like this remind us that justice can still be served.